Okay, my name's John Geib. I've been a master gardener for about 10 years now. I've been studying a couple of the specialties. I'm both a vegetable specialist, which I do a lot of talks on also. For my birthday last year, I got to go spend 3 days down in Houston learning about compost. Most people are like, really? It was my birthday present to myself, was the trip to Houston to go learn about compost. For about 4 years for this to come around again. So I've always had I didn't really compost, but you know, we still made sure we could get some good soil. You know, we're going to have 3 major areas we're going to talk about. Talk about the benefits of composting and what we can do with the compost a little bit, why it's good for us and why we should be doing it in general. Then we'll talk about how to make the compost. You know, not only things to put in, things not to, but all the specifics that we need to do for around here especially. And then I'll get into, on the last session, I'll get into a couple of the little specialties in composting, which is worms, composting with worms, and then compost tea, which we've been getting a lot of questions about. So I wanted to make sure we cover that today too. So when we talk about the benefits for composting, there's 3 major benefits. First major benefit is is for the environment. We spend a lot of money throwing stuff in the trash, and if we can go ahead and not throw it in the trash, all the better. Especially if we can use it someplace useful. The soil conditions around here leave a lot to be desired, and so compost can really help with that. But when you look at it realistically, when we're talking about home composting, it's a matter of money. It can save us quite a bit of money if we actually do a lot of home composting. Now, when we're talking environmental benefits here, this was about 6-year-old data. That's the closest I could find. Each and every one of us throws out about 1,500 pounds of trash into the landfill every year. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about that, 2/3 of it is compostable. Okay. So that's quite a bit of it that we don't have to actually be throwing into the trash. Now, of that, another 20% of it, roughly, is actually easily recyclable in the ways of metals and glass. So, think about that next time you're, hauling all the stuff out to the trash can going, how much of this should I actually be throwing out? Okay. When we're talking specifics, Abilene has 2 landfills. Both of them are privately owned, believe it or not. One by Republic Services, the other by a company called AEL, which is Abilene Environmental Landfill. Both of these are side by side. They're up just off of 277 to the north of town. Republic Services is much larger than AEL's. That's the one that handles most of the waste coming off of Abilene. AEL handles a lot more of the environmentally unfriendly trash. Think anything contaminated with oils, that sort of stuff. And any of the stuff that we really don't want leaching down into our water supplies. So most of that goes into the AEL landfill. Abilene itself has quite a bit of recycling efforts. They had stopped for a while with the neighborhood recycling centers, then they went ahead and started them back up. They've got 9 of them in town. So each of these, you're able to haul in your cardboard, paper, and aluminum and metals to go ahead and recycle. So it's a good place to get rid of a lot of the little scrap that you have if you aren't going to compost it. So these are fairly easy. They're big trash bins that you can just kind of toss your stuff into. It's nice and easy. The next one that we've got is the Environmental Recycle Center. This one is the one that handles all the environmentally throw in the trash can. So we're talking chemicals like herbicides, pesticides, whatever else we want to deal with, paints, batteries, that sort of stuff. All of this nasty stuff needs to be going into this place. This one specifically, if you know where the Abilene Animal Shelter is, it's just north of that. That's Oak Street's just a hair east and a couple blocks north is where the center is. So it's kind of a nice place to get rid of all the nasty stuff that you don't want. Also, a lot of people do things like throw out half-full cans of paint. And so you can go buy, if you have just a little paint project that you don't care what the color is really, you can go paint from them. Now, the one thing about all of the specific, unique type centers like this one, for Abilene, you have to be an Abilene resident. They will ask for your license and some proof that you are an actual citizen of Abilene. So that's the one problem for those of us that live out in the country. So, yeah. The next one is the Citizens Convenience Center. This is the item for big, bulky items. Think couches, furniture. Another big one here. Oh, electronics. All of those need to go over there. So it's, like I said, got to be a citizen of Abilene, but you can get rid of a lot of the waste that we need to try and not take to the landfill, at least as a big chunk. So, this one is over off of Highway 80, over by 322, if you all know where the Brush Recycling Center is. Speaking of the Brush Recycling Center, that's the next one. This is the place for any of your big yard waste. You can go ahead and drop it off over there. It does do like a monthly pickup. So you need to go ahead and check department website and check into that and see when those things. Now, the nice thing about the Brush Recycling Center is you can go up there. Anybody that's gone to the box stores, purchased a bag of mulch, understands how much money you can save doing this. The mulch is free if you wish to load it yourself. If you wish to load it yourself and you want the big dumpster or front end loader to go ahead and load your truck up, that's fine. It'll be free to load, or $5 a cubic yard. Now, they'll have a second type of mulch. That's the basic mulch that they've got. The second type of mulch is what they call the premium mulch, double churn or double cut mulch. It's a lot finer. It's a lot better. It's $7 a cubic yard, regardless of they load it. So, but good place to go get a lot of free mulch. And depending on how much composting you want to do, it's a for some of your bulk to start your compost pile. We had a ice storm back in Midland when I was living over there. City of Midland was like, bring all of your branches and down tree limbs, come over to the local parking lot next to the stadium and just drop them off. We'll take care of them. And they had one of those big, huge grinding machines, and they spent 6 months grinding tree trunks, tree branches, and all the other stuff into mulch. I went and got multiple loads from there because they just loaded up. They're like, please get rid of it for us. So, but then they went ahead and they shipped it off and sold it over at their recycling. Yes, ma'am.
Is that for only Taylor County residents, or?
I think you can show up. As far as I know, you don't have to be a resident to pick up. Especially if you're loading it yourself, they aren't going to care. You show up and leave, they're not going to pay any attention.
They didn't ask us anything.
Yeah. So, and this is the nice thing for mulch. It's kind of free for everybody, and they're just trying to get rid of it before it goes into the landfill. So, any more questions on Abilene's recycling efforts? Okay. Now, soil quality. Our next big major for why we want to do composting. If you're in town or south of town, you've got clay. Absolutely horrid stuff. Dries out, it is concrete, gets wet, and it is modeling clay, and you cannot, it is just horrid. When it is in the modeling clay version, it is so compact that actually no air can get into the roots of your plant, and that can and drown them. So we really need to, see what we can do about getting something to break up that. If you live north of town, say Anson, areas actually have beach sand basically for their areas. Almost as bad as the clay. water that lands on that sand just goes straight through. There's no holding capacity. And so, it speeds, so any on ever can get blown up too. So adding compost really does help us a lot. For the clay soil, it breaks up that clay structure, allows moisture to actually flow through, so it actually doesn't until it gets really, really wet. Because of that, as it dries out, the moisture that's been absorbed into the compost actually well, so instead of to mud and then straight back to it's a much longer phase between now it goes back to a little hard, so it a whole lot keeping the for clay soil. Structure to it to actually bind the sand together, and so we can actually work pretty well. It's now because they don't have, The other problem that we have around here, our soil pH, depending on where you're at in town, that is the problem with having that high alkaline soil is that it locks up a lot so that the plants can't get to them. Most of those soils are easily accessible at a pH of about 7. Is you can't change the soil of your pH. Well, the best way to change your soil is to add lots of compost. Adding enough compost really benefit your flower beds and your vegetable garden beds. Because a lot of our soil doesn't have a lot of oil in it, there's not nearly enough microbial life in the soil to really build up and they run and the plants. If we add that organic compost, or organic material and compost into the soil, we do get a good mix of life into the soil, which helps the plants out tremendously. Any other questions on soil problems that we might have? Okay. Now, when we're talking home composting as opposed to general composting, that like commercially available stuff, the one big key thing here is that we're taking all of our material that we need to recycle and we're recycling it on site. Okay. This allows us to not have to travel, either drive to drop stuff off, have the trash trucks come in and haul it off for us, whichever of those things. Out of the soil and whatnot, turning it back. The other thing about it, like I said, we're adding a lot of that organic material into the soil, taking it out a lot to benefit. And then because we're improving that soil both with the microbial levels and with the moisture retention, we can stop with watering quite so much because that moisture level is held up a little bit in that compost. And compost actually acts a little bit as a fertilizer. It's not a real strong fertilizer. It's about a 1-1-1 fertilizer when we look at it. So per inch added to the soil. But it really builds up that the microbial life in the soil, so that actually helps benefit what nutrients are in the soil can get into the plants. So here's the big one when we talk about everything comes down to money. This is where home composting really helps. You go down to any of the big box stores, compost is about $175 a cubic yard when you figure it out. If you're looking at just soil, I've seen what the soil prices have done in the last couple of years, and it is just absolutely incredible. Just getting standard, potting soil at the Big box stores now is running about $165 a cubic yard. So if you're building any new garden beds and you're trying to amend your soil, that's a lot of money. I mean, I build large, fairly tall raised beds. These things are taking 4 and 5 cubic yards of soil. So you're looking at $700 to $800 per bed just in soil, just to fill them up. And if I can by doing home compost, guess what? Now the other thing is there's a place in town used to actually be able to get bulk compost. They know sell bulk compost, what they call composted topsoil. It's about a 50-50 mix of compost and their topsoil mix. It's a soil mixed with sand, mixed with the compost. It's pretty decent stuff. It's still $80 a cubic yard, and then you've got to haul it in, and it's about, I think he said it was $60 to deliver in town. So it gets expensive quick. So if we can do home composting, we can save a lot of money. So now, when we're talking compost, we've got a lot to deal with. We're going to talk about what we can add into our compost, what we can't add into it. We'll talk about we're from A&M as a master gardener. We talk about science. We don't. Oh, I use this way so it works. That's not going to cut it for A&M. We're going to have to talk the science. There is a science behind compost, but there's also a little bit of an art, okay? And that's because we live in the big country and it's kind of a unique environment for a lot of people. So we're going to have to talk about the art of composting around. We'll talk about the two major types of composting methods, the hot method and the cold method. Those are fairly easy to do either way. It's a matter of how much time you want to put into your compost pile and how fast you need to get your compost pile out. Okay. Talk about a little bit about how to organize your compost pile and then what we can do with the compost once we actually get it done. Okay. Now, if you go out there and look for books on composting, there are very few that are good. Most of the ones that are out there are actually written by people in the Northeast or the Northwest. And if you know anything about the environments of those areas, they are nothing like West Texas. They're also written by people that aren't necessarily trained in compost and the science behind it. So a lot of times they're talking anecdotal evidence. They're not talking, this is how it needs to be. These are the factors that you actually have to worry about. And so I found the books out there are pretty much not very good. The one I would argue with on that is the Rodell book on composting. I'll leave it up here so you guys can look at it during the breaks. But it's very well written, but it's a generic book on the science of composting. So we'll have to worry about what it's going to be like to what we need to do here specifically. So one of the things they talk about when they're talking literature a lot of times, the methods, they don't really define the cold method and how we're trying to break those apart. And so there's a little bit of confusion there. And there's also a little bit of confusion on what we call the carbon ratio. And so those are the two big issues that we have with most of the literature out there. And go and talk about compost in the forums and groups or anything like that. It gets quick. There's the list of a lot of the little things that people will talk about. You have to do this. You can't do that. This. No. It all depends on what your particular situation is on a lot of these things. Now, like I said, we're here. We're science-based. It's a very simple science, but it does work. We need to worry about playing with it on our own environment. A little bit based on where you put your pile, how much wind you're going to get. Little things can change just how you build your compost pile. For the most part, we'll talk the science and what we worry about. So what we're looking at the leaves and debris off of and plants and stuff like that, falls to the ground, gets wet. Yeah, gets their little, and that helps return all of this back into the tree roots. Now, the lack of rain as everything dries out, and the wind then decompose. Really, that's what we really have to be talking about composting and getting everything set up. Composting itself for us, and we'll break down quickly. When we get done with it, molds, insects, critters, to go ahead and break down that material. We're going to try and do it in the oxygen, aerobic decomposition. The reason we want to do it with as an aerobic decomposition, it doesn't stink, usually, unless there's issues. If it's stinking, that on anaerobic, which is without oxygen, it's still breaking. It's going to stink. Really don't want to smell that. It's the wonderful rotten egg smell that we see when stuff gets. In the end, we're going to end up with humus, which is a soil. It's the compost that we talk about. It's going to be filled with carbon, nitrogen, and a lot of microbial activity, both alive, dormant, dead, just all sorts of stuff, and all of that's going to help build up that soil. Okay. Now, when we're talking organic, anything that has alive recently. So this animals, degrade, things like body. Well, the avian flu last year, and they were wiping chickens on the time. Well, those dead chickens. The gentleman that is in charge of the department, actually, he titles himself the king of. His big job is to work with commercial farmers and growers, especially when they have mass kill-off and having to deal with all of these carcasses and getting rid of them in an environmentally friendly manner. And so the big way they do it is through. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Like I said, with and then have the wind try to make sure we keep all of our stuff self-contained so that we can have moisture and keep. When we're looking at how fast a how much energy or how much energy available for them to go ahead. The more they reproduce, the more they feed, the more they reproduce, and it gets into a nice little cycle. So if we get everything balanced out right, we can decompose stuff pretty quickly. So the amount of oxygen, though, because these microbes are usually living off of in an oxygen-rich environment, the more oxygen they have, the faster they can grow and reproduce. So we're worried about oxygen, we're worried about moisture, because if it dries out too much, it won't decompose. So we need to kind of keep all of these little items balanced as much as possible. They've got a lot of leeway, but we can, the better we can keep it right around the perfect point, the better the stuff will compost. When we're talking building our compost pile, we usually talk about two types of material that we're putting into our compost pile. One we define as brown, one we define as green. Items in the brown pile are very high in carbon. A lot of times they're what we call hydrophobic, which means they repel water. They don't want to absorb all of that moisture, which can be a problem when we're trying to decompose something. We need that moisture in there. But that high carbon is very beneficial for crops to feed on. Now, the greens are a much higher nitrogen source. This provides a lot of the energy into the equation. And so, the more energy we can put in, the better the microbes will be able to survive. The problem is if you get too much nitrogen in there, it goes to the other end where it starts getting a little stinky. So we have to be careful in how much we need, which boils down into our carbon to nitrogen ratio. Speaking of carbon to nitrogen ratios, when we're looking at mixing up our pile, we're looking at usually doing about 2 parts brown to 1 part green by weight. Okay, so 2 pounds of brown material, 1 pound of green material. One of the things about the green material, it's usually much wetter because it's usually got a lot of moisture in it. And so the actual volume amount is not nearly as much as the brown is, which can be kind of an interesting thing to think about when we're working on it. That last line down there, you'll see that website, the nmcomposters.org. That is the New Mexico equivalent to A&M. It is their website. They have a wonderful calculator on there. If you're doing your usual stuff that we usually put into compost, leaves, grass clippings, maybe some manure or whatever, that's not too hard to worry about. We can usually kind of estimate what we're doing for a compost pile to get a carbon to nitrogen ratio about where we want. If we're doing something weird and unique, a lot of times I'll go there just to see what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is. If I throw a log in, it's got a carbon to nitrogen or carbon ratio of so much. If I put that into the pile as a sawdust, the same amount of material, it has a much higher ratio, just because it's got a lot more surface area on it. And so when the area hits, that's where the microbes are working at. So on a tree log, it's, the working over much less surface area. So it ends up with a carbon to nitrogen ratio that's much lower than if we're talking like sawdust. And so if I'm throwing a bunch of sawdust into my compost pile, I'll go up to this website, hit their calculator, and kind of put in the oddball stuff I'm putting in just so I can kind of get my nitrogen ratio where I want it. It's kind of neat because they've got a whole list of stuff that you can add into compost. They'll do the usual leaves, branches, whatnot, sawdust. If you've got things like old bags of fertilizer or something that you want to throw in, you can put that in. They've got a bunch of those type of items. And they have those down here, and then across the top they have measurements. And these go for anything from like spoons, cups, bags, bales, trash can fulls, wheelbarrow fulls, So you can kind of play around with what you actually have and how much you have to kind of figure out what your ratios are going to be like. What we're looking for though is a carbon to nitrogen ratio about 30 to 1. 25 to 30 to 1 gets us just about optimal to decompose. If we start getting a little bit too low of a carbon ratio, too high of a carbon ratio, we end up with slow decomposition. If we end up with too high of a carbon ratio, we end up with stink, and we don't want that either. So, now when we're talking browns, we're talking the usual stuff we're looking for: leaves, tree branches, any yard waste that we have, as long as it's been dried out. Okay, so dried grass clippings, hay, nutshells, anything like that, paper products. I don't know how many pounds a week of junk mail that I get. I tear off any labels or the little plastic labels that we get on those. I'll cut the windows out, those go in the trash can. All the rest of that paper products from the junk mail goes straight into my compost pile. Best use of junk mail I've ever found. So, but all the other prepper products, your cardboards, your toilet paper rolls, all that, any old used paper towels, all of that can go in as a brown source. Some other brown sources that people may not think about, dryer lint. Now, the key thing when you think about dryer lint, make sure it's coming off of a load of laundry that has been 100% organic material. So if you had t-shirts in there with 50-50 cotton polyester, you probably don't want to put that in there because half of that lint is probably going to be microplastics. You don't really want to put that into your compost pile because it doesn't decompose. So, 100% cotton, silks, burlaps, wool, any of those sorts of things will be real good for that. If you want to take you've got one of the newer vacuums that have the cyclone machines, and you don't have a bag of stuff from your house, you have just a container full, you can use that. Key thing to think about that, though, how much plastic has been floating around your house that may be in that trash also. So you may want to, if you've got a whole chunk of it that's a certain type, you may want to go ahead and throw that into the compost pile. So, any wood products? Now, the key thing on the wood products here is untreated wood products. Pressure-treated lumber is treated with some chemicals you probably don't want, ground up and put into your soil. Especially if it's an older, if you find some old lumber or something that's been pressure-treated, a lot of it will actually have arsenic in it, and so it's not something you really want to put into your compost pile. Yes, ma'am?
So what do you think about sawdust from plywood, which is made by gluing layers of wood? So you don't have glue in your sawdust.
I wouldn't have a problem with it in mine particularly. I don't know what the wood is or the glues are. I'm sure they're probably formaldehyde based, realistically, or at least they used to be. I don't know if they are still. And that a lot of times is actually an organic product, at least somewhat. So I mean, there are some chemicals in there, but most of those have volatilized off. So it's kind of up to you on that, whether you do it or not.
And you feel comfortable composting junk mail? I've heard some people say that, well, you don't know that it's soy ink on junk mail. It's more likely printed from a laser printer, which is toner and plastic. And I don't know what
Yeah, I mean,
it's working for you.
the ink on the junk mail, yeah, if you're using something that's got laser printer on it, yeah, you may want it, but
I don't know where it comes from. So.
Yeah, I don't know what the specific makeup is like laser toner. Okay.
Maybe it's negligible amount.
Yeah, I would say it's probably a negligible amount.
But dryer lint,
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I mean, you're talking piles of dryer lint usually, so it's got half of that'll be a plastic lump. So now for toner, I couldn't. So I do know toner washes off reasonably easily. So my guess probably get out, it'll probably just straight out of the pretty quickly. So that I couldn't tell you for sure. Now, when we're talking green material, notice a lot of the stuff that we have in that first line there is the same stuff we were talking about as a brown material. This is the green version of it. If it's green and nice and fresh, we can use it as a green material. So we're talking, grass clippings, yard clippings, that sort of stuff. Once it dries out, it becomes brown. Okay, that process of it drying out pulls a lot of the nitrogen source out of the material that we're looking at. The one key thing about this is weed seeds and grass seeds. You don't want to put those into your compost pile. Compost is a wonderful material for starting plants, especially Bermuda grass. If you leave weed seeds in there, officially we promote Bermuda grass as a lawn around here, but it also is a very big weed if you aren't careful. Any of our food products like fruit and veggies, especially the fresh ones, we can use those as a good source of nitrogen. Coffee grounds. Starbucks officially, as a company policy, they're supposed to store coffee grounds for any composters that would like to save them. And that's not necessarily the case depending on the store. So, you know, if you want, you can try and talk to the local coffee shops and go, hey, I'd like to keep, you know, compost your coffee grounds. Can you store them up for me? And a lot of times they will. The problem is they have regulators coming in and hassling them about having trash laying around. Tea bags work well. Now, the one problem with tea bags, most tea bags have that little staple on them. Is not a problem. It's metal, it rusts, it'll decompose into your soil. It may poke you if you happen to decompose all the way, you know, stick you with some stuff that's not fun. But a lot of times staples put it in plastic. So not much, but a little bit. So yeah, just one of those things to think about. For those of you that have fur babies, how many spare fur babies do you come up with a week? You know? So all of that can go into your compost pile. Now the nice thing about that is that the volatilize off the nitrogen. And so that's a good source of nitrogen that can be stored until you're ready to build your compost pile. So just kind of stick it in a trash bag and, you know, set it off to the side. Other green additions, things like manures. Yes, ma'am.
Quick question, on the fur babies, what if they're a little guinea pig? And so they have a vegetative diet?
That's fine. It's not going to hurt anything. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, any fur babies will work. It doesn't matter what type they are. Manures, we're looking at vegetarian animal manure. Llama, sheep, goat. We put chicken in here even though they're omnivores because they do enough pre-processing of the manure that it's not a problem. I'll talk about some issues with some of the manures a little bit later. If you have any leftover fertilizers or anything like blood meal, the 2500, you know, nitrogen fertilizers we're throwing on, especially if these things have gotten wet and turned into a solid block, you can't spread them anymore. You can put them in your compost hammer, break them up a little bit, at least into smaller chunks, and then spread it out for it. Fish emulsion, you can add things like that, you know, dead fish products. Problem is they stink, so you may not want to put those in. On composting. Our nitrogen source is from urine. It is very high in nitrogen. It also is liquid, so keep your pile liquid. I'm not going to talk any more about it, except if you do want to get into that sort of a, just do some, especially science-based. Okay, so not your average web online to dig in to find some research on it. So things we don't want to add in, we're looking at plants and seeds, weed seeds on it. So these will end up compost. We'll go ahead and okay. We'll, you know, said really up those terminate in your compost pile, which is not going to be fun. Things like wood ash, a lot of people talk about adding wood ash into your compost to help boost the potassium in it. If you're going to need your soil for potassium or any of the other, it's best to do it afterwards, and it's best to do it based off of a soil sample. We do have soil sample bags in the back, so go ahead and grab a couple, but always amend your soil based off of that soil sample, not off of you think to. Meat, fish, oils. It's best if you do that in very small amounts. The big problem with those items is they have a tendency to, especially on the meat, and so it's usually better because it gets smells into your compost. Critters you don't want to come around. You can do composting of meat materials and such. I've done, a couple years ago, we were in Midland still. We harvested out some chickens, and I went into my compost pile. Now, back there, I had a huge compost pile, and so I was able to dig into my compost pile, put in a layer of shredded paper, threw in all the appropriate, high nitrogen meat products, cover it over with some more shredded paper, soak it down a little bit, and then I reburied that into the middle of the compost pile, and it was 2 feet underground. So I didn't have issues with anything coming around because it was down deep enough that nothing could smell it. So, and it decomposed really quick. 3 weeks, it was completely decomposed.
The issue of putting the product is a matter of smell rather than,
Yes.
it's still beneficial to the compost.
Yeah, it's still beneficial. And that's will things like all of those through the pile and digging it apart. Other things to avoid, anything that's not organic, plastic, those sorts of things. It's herbicides, herbicides, all of those will usually carry over straight through your compost process and into the ground wherever you add your compost. Charcoal products are a big one. They're leftover fires and throw them into your compost pile. And that's so you're putting lighter fluid in, something you probably don't want to deal with. Manures, if carnivore animals, and the big ones are dogs and pigs, their physiology is a non-zero chance of diseases going and cross-contaminating. It's a very small chance, but it's still a non-zero chance. So we highly recommend not doing that. Now, my suggestion, if you want to compost those, especially if you've got a couple of dogs and you're trying to keep your yard cleaned up, instead of tossing that in the trash can, make a separate compost pile and compost that material and strictly use that to go make pretty roses. Turn something that stinks into something that smells beautiful. So that would be the way to do that. Use those on strictly ornamental plants. We were talking about the issues possibly with junk mail. One of the big things with junk mail is the glossy paper coming in. The big paper and wax paper is they don't absorb moisture enough. And so it really doesn't want to break down because of that. Additions, for the most part, is well contained. Doesn't either to addition. Now, if you really want to add something into it, once you've done a compost pile, you can take a lot of compost pile and start it into the other one. That will give it a little bit of a boost in the back microbial life, going into the new compost pile. But it doesn't. You don't really need to do that. I'll talk about that briefly on what I usually do when I'm doing compost. The other thing you'll see these things at the garden stores and the big box stores is Compost Maker. It's a little jug. It's supposed to be all these beneficial microbes and stuff. How long has that sat on the shelf? Probably killed off all the bacteria. How long did it ship in a cargo container across the Southwest desert at 190 degrees inside that cargo container, killing off whatever was in there? So more than likely, that compost maker probably doesn't have a whole lot of useful stuff in it by the time it gets to you. So it's pretty much a waste of money. So the microbes that are in soil naturally as you're building your compost pile is enough to go ahead and get your compost pile started. It doesn't need to do much. The one other thing, especially this is one of the ones you see a lot of places, talk about adding lime to your compost. Problem is it adds alkalinity to soil or yards. And right at 45 minutes again. That's I've got this time. It's 45 minutes even with questions. Yes, ma'am.
It's more about the mold. Like, if someone, like a recycling center, if someone, I guess, recycles like a diseased tree from plant like that, what are the chances of it?
Okay, diseases, recycling center through the chopped trees. There is a chance, but very little. Usually in the drying process that ends up happening with mulch when it's out, usually will kill off a lot of that. If you're going to throw it into like a compost pile, a lot of times the bacteria and stuff in there and the heat will take care of that. But there is a chance, but yet to hear of it been spread through mulch. Yes, ma'am.
So I saw that one of the local TV stations says that Sam's is fixing to start a recycle thing.
Okay.
I looked at it. They're going to take a lot of the plastic that the city does not currently take. So ones, twos, they're going to take the grocery bags, fours, so like the bread
Yeah.
things, and then some of the containers like for takeout food, like fives.
Okay.
So that'll be something new, because right now the city doesn't take any plastics.
Yeah. And the one problem I have with plastics, even if they're labeled as recyclable, most of the time the recycling is not an actual recycling. It's usually going to go dump it somewhere else. There are a few that actually do recycle, but not very many. So, but if Sam's is doing something that actually is beneficial, that would be great. It would be nice. So, yes, ma'am.
What do you think about adding dairy products?
Dairy products to a compost pile? Like I said, you can do it. It's the big it is a lot of times it will be rancid and cause a little bit of odor. Now, if you're doing a little, or if you've got a fairly decent sized pile where you can kind of bury it into the middle, it. Yeah. On something like that, what you may want to do is go ahead and set the milk out, curdle up so it's not quite so liquid, and throw that in, and that way it's more of a solid material and it will have a tendency to get eaten. It'll get eaten up by insects a lot as much as decompose. So, other questions? All right, I think we're going to do at least one door prize, but I'm not sure. So that's up to Miss Kathy. Okay. So we talked about what we could put into our compost pile, what we couldn't. So now we have all the material that we're looking at building the compost pile. Now, how are we going to build it? Well, first thing we need to do is talk about which method we're going to use. Okay, two basic methods. One's hot, one's cold. The hot method, we're looking at building up some heat into it, and we're going to end up having to put labor into it to help turn the pile to keep it aerated. And in this process, it ends up cooking down the pile a lot faster. Cold composting, we don't turn the pile usually. It's the same thing that Mother Nature does. We're just kind of organizing it, keeping it contained for us. So When we're talking the hot compost method, we're trying to build heat, okay? We're trying to build in conditions that the bacteria and the microbes will go ahead and reproduce as fast as possible. What they do is they eat, they'll sit there, and in the process of breaking down the carbohydrates, that when they break that bond in the carbohydrates, that's what releases the heat, but that's how they're feeding. And so we go ahead and we get them feeding. They can reproduce. The more they reproduce, the more they feed. The more they feed, the more they reproduce. All of this is generating heat. That heat helps them in a little bit better quality environment for them. So they can run in 140 to 160 degree temperatures without a problem. And it actually helps them reproduce even faster. So it works really nice for them. When we do it, we build the pile all at one time. So we have all of our materials, we get them all prepped and ready, we build the pile, and it starts the process. Cold composting, a lot of times you'll just kind of add to it for a little bit at a time. So that's the big difference, is we're building them in batches. Because we're doing it as a batch, one of the key things we need to do is build a solid mass, usually a cubic yard of material, 3 by 3 by 3, up to about a 5 by 5 by 5 pile. And the reason I committed it 5 by 5 by 5, that's almost 5 cubic yards of material. And I can guarantee you that turning 5 cubic yards of material is not fun without mechanical means. I can tell you this from experience, because that's how much I used to turn by hand. And that is a workout. So if you're 20 years old, that's good. I'm not 20 anymore, so this doesn't work for me anymore.
That's where you have your son do it.
No, that's why I have a tractor. So, piles will heat up and then start to cool off. And then once it starts cooling off, you're going to need to turn the pile again to get some more air in it. What the limiting factor is on these compost piles like this usually is the amount of oxygen in the pile. And so they start burning out a little bit of the oxygen and some of the moisture, so that the reproductive cycle kind of dies off, the heat drops down a little bit, and we know we need to add, rechurn it and get it prepped and ready to get in that optimal cycle again. As they proliferate, a lot of enzymes to help break down all the different materials. That's causing all of our heat. Depending on the time of year, you'll get temperatures anywhere from 100 to really up to about 160 degrees. Usually 140 is what they consider normal for a hot compost pile. 140, if you can maintain that for 3 days, will kill off most diseases, viruses, and weed seeds. The problem is maintaining 140 degrees for 3 days. And that's where, and got to remember that when we're talking this big pile, the outside edges a lot of times are going to be a lot cooler and a lot drier, so they aren't going to have the environment that the center section is. One of the nice things about turning it is we turn what's been hot and nice and cooked in the middle to the outside, and hopefully a lot of that outside material gets into the middle where we can do it. I'm a dedicated composter. I really work on trying to get my compost piles nice and hot. I still will not put in diseased material and seeds into my compost pile. All right, and that, like I said, I'm trying to keep the hot temperatures up there. I know realistically I can't. So that's one of the reasons we do not recommend those.
If it's 100 degrees outside, does that mean your compost is easier? I mean, can you figure it's...
It'll get warmer in the summer. So you'll hit the 150, 160 degrees. I've seen 170 in my compost pile. The time that I found 170 in my compost pile, I actually had many chunks of charcoal throughout the compost pile. So a large enough compost pile, in the right conditions, can actually catch fire. But it's extremely rare, and for a home composter, you're not going to run into that problem. So in the winter, if you get to be 100 degrees inside, you're doing pretty good. Just because there's so much cool weather cooling off the outside of that pile, it just won't build the heat quite as much. Depending on how often you're turning that pile, once a week, every other week, every couple days, depends on how long it's going to take. 3 to 6 months is what most people will figure. If you're turning it about once a week, you'll probably get it about 3 months. If it's every other week, you're looking at probably closer to 6 months. A lot of times once we do that though, when we do that, we usually do it in a 2 or 3 bin system. The nice part about it, having a 2 or 3 bin system, you start your pile here, get it up, cooked, you go to turn it, you turn it into the next bin. Okay? And then when it gets done with that process cool and you need to turn it again, you flip it back over to the other bin and you kind of bounce back and forth between the other bins. The third bin's usually for your finished compost. And so you can just kind of put it there and leave it there and keep it nice and moist until you need it. A lot of times we'll do a cold curing phase after we've done the hot composting. This microbial or the bacterial decomp that we've been working on into more of a fungal breakdown. So it kind of gets a double compost, and any of the little excess stuff gets kind of broken down. So it's kind of a useful thing. Don't have to do it, but it's nice. Now, depending on how hot you get your pile, you can lose as much as half of the pile's original mass in loss basically to heat once everything breaks down. A little bit of heat and also just compaction. So think if you start with a cubic yard, you end up with half a yard. So the more you can build, the better. I've seen a couple of videos on it and I've tried it. It does work. They call it the 18-day compost challenge. You go in, you get your compost pile set up, you get it all nice and ready, get it starting up and cook, and you keep a good close eye on that thermometer. And you'll watch your thermometer come up, it'll peak up at its temperature and it'll hold for about 2 days and then start to drop off. And as soon as that temperature drops below 120 degrees, pull the thermometer, go out, turn your pile, stick the thermometer back in and watch the temperature back up and hold. And every time the temperature drops below 120, you go out and flip it. And it's about every 3 days. But after about 3 weeks, you have compost. So it's very quick, but it's a lot of effort in a very short amount of time. So it can be done. If you're looking at commercial composters, this is usually what you're looking at a lot of times on the right. They'll sit there, they'll get their materials built up. They've got a neat little tractor attachment. It's kind of like a hay cutter, except it churns, it looks like a hay cutter, except it churns all the stuff up and turns it over and then just drops it out a chute on the back. And in the process, it forms this beautiful triangular shaped windrow. So they get a complete turnover and they'll run that tractor down usually every other day to turn it and keep it all nice and hot. And these things will get up to 140, 160 degrees and stay that way for 2 or 3 weeks. And it's very nice. The big problem that they have around here, they've got a lot of surface area, and so you end up with a lot of problems with losing moisture. So most of the commercial composters are down, at least in Texas, are down towards Houston and East Texas area, where they get a lot more moisture. The one on the left up there is closer to what I have. Not quite that big, but it's close. Now, notice all the steam coming off of it. That's all of your moisture being evaporated out. So around here, we try and keep them covered so that we don't lose all of that moisture. So, for the one that won the thermometer, that's what they look like. You can get them all different sizes, anywhere from 18 to 48 inches long. You can get them at, I've seen them at the box stores occasionally, and you also see them at the garden centers. A lot of times they'll have temperature ranges on the ends. Just kind of gives you an idea of what you need to be running for your temperatures. So you just kind of make sure you stick it in down towards the middle of the pile so you can get a good temperature reading. These are the 2 and 3 bin setups. Yeah, like I said, yeah, add to it, work on your pile, and you can kind of toss back and forth between the 2, and then once you're done, you can kind of put it in the 3rd one. So works kind of nice. I said a lot of times we'll cure the compost out a couple of weeks after it's been finished, just to kind of make sure there's nothing, no fumes are in there that we might not want. Kind of lets everything kind of settle itself in before we use it. It's like I said, it's usually a cold fungal phase. And then there's some acids and stuff a lot of times that will build up in your normal compost pile. Nothing really major for us, but it's kind of nice to be able to disseminate those out. Yes, sir.
Is it beneficial to water the compost at any time?
You're going to want to try and keep your moisture content at about 50%. Okay, so think coffee grounds. Use coffee grounds. They're nice and moist. They aren't dripping anymore. That's the moisture level we want to try and keep it at. So anytime we turn it, we're going to want to try and water it down. And then we just, every once in a while, we want to make sure that it's still moist. So we want to keep it, maybe pull back a little bit, see if it's still moist inside, and then water it if need be. So. Cold composting.
Sorry.
Did you at least get him?
I think so.
So, cold composting. Key difference is that we are not trying to create heat in that compost pile. Now, a lot of times, especially if we build it as a batch up front and start our compost pile, a lot of times we'll have heat up to the front, and then it kind of cools off, and it just runs from there. We don't turn the compost pile. We just kind of let it sit there. Okay, so it's nice, especially for those of us that are either lazy or just don't have time to turn the compost pile every week or two. But it takes a lot longer to get that compost pile to compost out. Back when I was a kid, the way we used to compost, we'd take all of our leaves and yard debris in the fall, run them across the street into the woods in Maryland, where it was nice and moist. We put everything into a single pile, and then we'd back up for last year's pile if we needed dirt, and that's where we got the soil from. And that was all the compost that Mother Nature had given us. We didn't have a clue how it worked exactly. We just knew that we put all the stuff here, and next year it was ready to use. So, that you don't have to turn it, so just as long as it's kept moist, it will decompose. So
Therefore, you do need to add a lot more water to it.
yes, overall it will take a lot more water because it will lose a lot more over the period of time. So there's a couple of methods you can do, which I'll talk about here in a second. Not only just the standard compost pile, but do things like pit, trench methods. Those of you that have heard of lasagna or sheet composting, a lot of times that's what this is cold composting. Pits and trenches are just about the same thing. Trench is nothing more than a lot of pits built right next to each other. The idea is that you take your compost material, mostly your greens and a little bit of browns, dump them into the pit, and then just cover them up and let them naturally decompose in the ground. Okay, it's an anaerobic decomp. So if you were to dig this up in 3 months, it's going to stink, but it's not that big of a deal because it's buried underground. Now the neat one that I like is the one on the right up there. It shows the picture of the trench. If you look at it, they've got a whole row of plants right next to it. And so they've trenched right along the front of them, buried in all of this good high nitrogen source material, and they're going to bury it back in. What's going to happen is that stuff is going to decompose. It's going to get it's not going to be the normal soil. It's going to be basically a compost there. So that trench will keep a very good moisture sink. And so the roots from those bushes will come over naturally and want to grow into that trench. And that way they'll have access to moisture a lot more than normal. And they'll have a lot more nutrients. And so that whole plants will be fed off of that one trench for a couple of years, probably. Another one that we can use, especially in fall. Yes, ma'am.
How far was the trench from the plants?
Probably 18 inches, something like that. Depending on the size of the bush you're looking for. If they're small, the roots aren't going to be very far out. But if it's a bigger bush, the will extend out a ways. So you don't want to the roots if you're going to be doing a new trench. So one of the ones we can use in fall, especially where we've got lots of leaves into, just make sure that their bags have some moisture in it, tie them up nice and tight, airtight, in a nice shady spot, and come back next year. It will be a bag of soil, of compost. Now, the problem that you have with this, when you go to crack open that bag, it's going to stay because it's an anaerobic process. So a fairly good puff of hydrogen sulfide that'll pop out. So you're going to want to hit this thing with a shovel from a foot or two away to let it air out, and then you can go ahead and crack that open. The reason I specifically mentioned that you put it in a nice shady spot or someplace that maybe has a tarp over top of it, the sun around here will eat that bag up in about 6 months. And so it usually takes 12 to 18 months for that the leaf mixture to actually decompose properly. And so that bag's not going to be in one attack for that whole length of time to keep it out of the sun. If you have excess kitchen scraps, go ahead and just kind of blend them up. A little bit of water, a little bit, just kind of pour it in and then just cover it over a couple inches of soil. That also works too. Not quite as good as digging a little bit deeper trench, but it does work. We're talking the methods. Hot compost, looking at trying to create heat, creating it as a batch, turning it as needed, and keeping it nice and moist. Okay? Cold composting, just kind of leave it alone. That's the big difference between the two. Key thing to think about when we're looking at it is trying to determine how much or how look when it's done, and when is our compost actually finished. Key thing to think about is there anything in that compost pile that looks like any of the materials. My compost piles a lot of times start off looking like this. You can come up and look at them a little later. But I've got layers of chicken litter, so it's pine shavings and chicken manure, and interspersed with shredded junk mail. Okay, so that's what it starts looking like. As it breaks down, for the most part, it looks pretty decent, but every once in a while, you'll still see chunks of paper and stuff in this. And that's one of the things I found that's kind of interesting is paper products, even if they've been in a compost pile for a month or two, a lot of times will still be white, which is kind of, but you'll eventually get broken down and it'll be gone and it'll all look just like soil and compost. And that's what we're looking for. If you're hot composting, one of the quick, easy ways to determine if it's a finished compost pile is when you're turning it. You turn it, get it all nice and moist again, prepped and ready to go build some more heat, and it doesn't heat up. It's done. There's nothing left in there for the bacteria and the microbes to eat on. So that it's ready to go. The other thing is you'll find a good finished compost has to it. There's no smells. Compost may have a little bit of a smell to it that's not quite as pleasant. It's usually not, but occasionally you'll get some minor smells. So now, when we're talking compost bins, we're trying to organize, so we have to put it usually in some sort of a bin. Our key problem here is containing the moisture, and so a lot of the compost bins that you'll find out there, either online with pictures of them or for sale, things like that, have a lot of holes in them to allow airflow. That's the last thing that ours because of our moisture, our low humidity. And so we're trying to seal up a lot of those holes. But what we're looking for is something we can add to and pull out our compost or turn fairly easily. Preferably something that looks reasonably nice. You know, a lot of times, you know, having a big ugly compost pile in the back of your yard isn't going to make the spouse happy. So you kind of want to try and make it at least a little bit pretty. Needs to be able to contain the material. Needs to be able to be covered fairly easily so that we can make sure that things don't get into it that we don't want, a lot in the way of critters a lot of times. And then we got to be able to manage that moisture flow. These are some of the ones you can buy online. As you notice, they are full of, and so buy duct tape and seal up all the holes around the sides, just because it's going to be too much. It's going to dry out very, very quickly. Yes, ma'am?
Even in cold composting, you don't want air?
Because it dries it out. We have to have that moisture. So, I used to say, I never met anybody that owned a tumbler that they enjoyed their roller. I had to change my. The big problem with the roller tumblers is either they're small, like 55-gallon barrel size, and they don't seem to they aren't big enough to get that good thermal mass into them to really heat up like they need to. The other problem that they run into is getting material in and out. You can get these as large as 6 feet in diameter. It has plenty of room for material. The problem is trying to get that thing to roll is not easy. So, but you know, they do work at least to some degree, but it's very results. Cinder block works for us because it's more. You have to. The wind doesn't blow through, and it's how you do it. You pull it, pull material out from, and you can just pull a couple blocks out of the way. A little heavy, but nothing too bad. So you can also make them as big as you want. It's nice because, like for me, I made it 6 inches wider than my tractor bucket, so I can get in there and easily turn it. So you can use things like straw bales. Just understand that the straw bale itself.
So how do you have the cinder block?
Usually what you can either use a tarp. I use personally plywood. I just put a big piece of plywood over it. It's not a complete seal because it's not perfect, but it covers 98% of the surface area, so it kind of keeps it the moisture contained. Yes, ma'am?
Does the color of the tarp matter?
The color of the tarp does not matter. The only reason the tarp is there is to seal it off. So you're not worried about trying to build heat through the tarp. If you have chickens, for those of us out in the outside city limits, they will love to dig through your compost bin and will scatter it. So that's not a problem because that's turning it, getting air into it. Adding a little extra nitrogen source in the process, so that's not a bad thing. Problem is having it open like this for them to have access to it dries it out pretty quickly. So it's usually better to just go ahead and have it covered. So this is what we call the New Zealand box. I'm guessing it was originally developed in New Zealand. What's nice about these is when you look at it, the posts have slots cut out to it. It's like 4x4 posts with slots. And the boards on all the sides just slide in. Okay, so you can easily remove a board, a couple of boards down, so you can actually pull and put material in. The nice thing about these, if you're building two side by side, your pile from one, you can pull the first couple of boards out, halfway down, and just easily push the material over, and then you have to worry about trying to shovel the rest of it. So half of the shovel is much easier. So these are really good boxes to have if you can get one or build one up. A couple more very similar, having the ability to pull off, sections of your compost bin is nice. So you can use simple as just a wire rack. The one big problem about something like this, especially in springtime, you can have this thing fully moist, ready to go, and 2 hours later it'll be dry because of the 8% humidity and 30-mile-an-hour winds. So these wouldn't work. You can do something so simple as just put plastic around it to seal them off. But remember what I said about plastic, it doesn't last but about 6 months. So if you're going to do something like this, I would recommend lining it with cardboard first, then put the plastic inside of that. That way the plastic is prevented from rotting with the cardboard, and the cardboard's kept dry, and then you build your compost pile on the inside of that. Yes, ma'am?
With the New Zealand box,
Yes.
with that wood, do you know how long that would hold up in West Texas?
It should last quite a while. Now, the wood can either be cedar, which won't rot, and so it'll last pretty much in, a decade. Or you can use pressure-treated lumber. It's, the ground contact with pressure-treated lumber is not nearly as big of a problem as it used to be. So the studies have shown that there's really no transference of the newer chemicals into the soil. So it's not that big of a problem for pressure-treated lumber.
That New Zealand one, are the posts actually buried into the ground for support?
Yes. Yeah. You want to go ahead and bury those in so that they don't move around. Any other questions?
I've also seen photos of concrete blocks that have the four corners. Would that be appropriate?
Could probably work, yeah.
On the ground.
Yeah. With any effort, so yeah, you could probably use those. I haven't seen them specifically for that.
Saw them in terms of not of composting, but for a raised garden.
Yeah, okay, that'd be kind of interesting. I haven't seen them, so I'll have to check into that. So, this is kind of one, somebody built up. Big problem with this is those screen sides. It's going to let in way too much airflow through these things. The lid, while it's nice to have this type of a lid, I would recommend breaking the lid up individually per bin, just because one, it's heavy, and two, you don't need to open all three at one time. You usually just need to open one at a time, maybe two. The bin doesn't have to be expensive. And free pallets just about anywhere these days. And so while it works, it's got a lot of air holes. So a couple layers of cardboard fitted in between the sides will keep the airflow down to a minimum. And so this will be a cheap, free, nearly free way of building a compost bin. Now, when we're building them, we have to remember a couple of things. We are talking about decomposing organic material. A lot of critters like decomposing organic material. Things like the little roly-poly up there, roaches, mites. So next to that. Sun out of the wind if at all possible, so we don't have quite as much issues with the airflow. When we're actually starting about building the pile, we talk about putting what we call coarse bulk material. A lot of times what we'll do this for is it creates air pockets. Now this coarse bulk material is going to be medium-sized branches, nothing too small, but finger size or so. And they kind of mix up together and they create like a little air pockets throughout the compost bin. Do a couple layers of these to help add like little air pockets to help keep that oxygen levels decent in the pile. Things like pine cones work well for coarse bulking material because they're a natural little sponge with lots of holes in it. Even larger shredded mulch will work well too. When we're starting about building it, as we build our bulk pile coming up, we'll usually put a layer of the coarse bulk material on the bottom, 6 to 10 inches or so to start with. Gives us a nice air pocket at the bottom, and then we start building on top of that. Build up build up a foot or so, add another small couple-inch layer of the bulk material, and keep going up until we're done with that. Once we get done at the top, we want to try and seal off the compost pile, so we're either talking shredded paper or mulch or something like that, just to kind of seal it off. If it's a dry material like that, it repels things like flies, fruit flies, any of the fly insects, because they don't like the dry material sitting on top. They like moist material to lay eggs in. So if it's a dry bulk material or dry material like mulch or something like that, it works well for that. Or we can go ahead and put a tarp over top of it. This is my compost pile I used to have in Midland. It's about 6 feet across, about 8 feet long, and about 4 feet tall when it was fully built. It had concrete or cinder block here across the back, and then this side actually just had a piece of corrugated tin is what I used on that side. I said, whatever I had on hand. I was trying to do it nice and cheap. Had it stacked down through the middle so that could cinder blocks so that I could have 2 separate piles. I'd run with one and then I'd start on the other one. You can see all the material I have just sitting there waiting to get built up into it once this one was done. I used to use old, I'd talk to people that had the soaker hoses that were no longer functional for them. They had solidified with calcium buildups, so they didn't drip, they just kind of sprayed. Well, I'd use those instead of the normal coarse bulking material. I'd use soaker hose. And so I'd run this layer of soaker hose all through my pile. And when I needed to rewater the pile, I'd just hook up to the soaker hose, soak the pile with that. And then when it drained, it was an airflow pocket through the whole pile. So it worked well for both of those.
John?
Yes, ma'am.
What is back to your, what on the left side, what are those pipes coming through there?
This,
Yes.
I had it was, I don't know if you've seen the compost bins that are like green 1-inch square material that you've ever seen. It's kind of like think a fence with 1-inch squares on it. Okay, that's what I had separating the 2 piles usually. But it was flexible, so I used that pipe as a tie-in point so it didn't bow out. Peel back the layers, you can see I had several inches of just shredded mulch on top. Some areas, you could tell wasn't quite done yet. We had a lot of shredded paper in it. Start digging into it and you can see, it's starting to decompose, but as you get deeper and deeper into the middle, it actually is pretty much ready for compost almost. Yes, ma'am.
So if, you set up you build your pile, and how long do you wait for it to start generating heat before turning? Or do you go ahead and turn, therefore starting to mix up all the stuff?
When you go ahead and you build it up, and it's all nice and moist and everything, it'll start building up heat immediately.
Okay.
So like within 24 hours, you'll see a temperature rise.
Okay.
And then I'll let it run until, at least until the temperature starts to drop. And a lot of times depends on my schedule. I'm like, at this time, so I didn't have time in the evenings to come out and turn a compost pile because it was 4 to 6 hours to turn that compost pile. And so I would sit there and wait, usually till the weekend, and then spend a Saturday turning my compost. So
Now, also, when you say turn, can that be just like flipping it over, or do you really have to mix it?
the more you mix it, the more air you'll mix into it. But just as long as you can get it turned up, the idea really, if you really want to get it well mixed up, the center section of your compost pile is going to heat up and compost down faster. The outside dries out a lot of times. And so what you really need to do is flip that completely, inside the middle to the outside and the outside to the middle, as much as possible. And then make sure everything gets re-moistened.
So that's more important than bottom goes to the top.
Yeah, it's more mix everything together as best as possible. So.
Do you think there'd be any issue building it underneath a large pecan tree?
It shouldn't be. I had a pecan tree over top of these. Of course, pecan tree was north of these, so it didn't actually shade it very much, but it did have some litter that would always fall off from the pecan trees. So, the other thing I did on mine, which was kind of a unique thing, I actually built mine on top of pallets. And so that first layer of coarse bulking material I talk about, that was actually a pallet. Okay, so it had an open air slot underneath, and then I put 1/4-inch hardware cloth on top of that and built from there. But as you can see, wrong button. Yeah, it's sealed off so that the air couldn't blow into it, but it still had that air gap in there. So as I went to pull it open to turn it or something like that, it would have a little bit of an airflow in there, but not enough to dry it out.
Did you have a problem with snakes or rodents or anything like that?
No, I had enough cats that solved that problem quickly. The crazy cat lady, that was me. We had way too many cats at this house. And I mean, way too many. Key thing, remember, is our low humidity, so we're trying to really prevent airflow through the pile, okay? So we're trying to build walls around the compost bin that are nice and sealed off as much as possible, and just add airflow by us turning and mixing it. Adding that bulking material, like I said, especially at the bottom, to make sure that we get that some air space so that, as it's burning it off, we got a little space for it to, air reserves to suck it up for the bacteria. Always make sure that we cover the piles. Flies and stuff love compost, and so we usually want to keep that covered to keep them out and also to keep the moisture in. When we get done and the compost is finished, a lot of times, we've got stuff in there that isn't quite done yet. Okay, even if the majority is, there's still chunks that aren't. If we've used some coarse bulking material in there, a lot of times that will not be broken down, and it's usually a little bit bigger. A lot of times you can use something like a milk crate, the old-fashioned plastic milk crates. Use that to pull the big stuff off, and then go through, and I use 1/4-inch hardware cloth, build little frames. You can either build a frame and set it over the wheelbarrow, and then just shovel in a couple scoops, shake it through, and sift it out. Now we were talking about additions to your compost pile to help get it started. All of the coarse bulking material that I use for one pile goes into the next one. So it's got all that bacteria on it, and it goes straight into the next pile. All of these little fines that didn't want to go through that 1/4-inch hardware cloth, all of that goes back into my new compost pile to help start it. So this is my starter if I ever use anything. It's just leftovers from the previous pile. And because it's mostly decomposed anyhow, it'll break down that much faster for this stuff. Now, the one I did in Midland, I actually built, because I was doing large-scale composting, like I said. I was doing 5-6 yards of compost at a time. I built a screen, little 1/4-inch hardware mesh screen, put it on a nice, good, steep angle, but it was set so I could pull the wheelbarrow underneath. And all I would have to do is shovel from the compost pile, throw it onto the screen, and it would self-screen itself. And so it was a lifesaver for not having to, okay, shovel a couple scoops in, shuffle it through, and then deal with it. It was all automatic. Just throw it on and let it sort itself. So, when we're talking about soil amending, what we need to do with the soil amending, we can do a couple of different methods. We can either just use it as a top dressing, kind of as, sort of like a mulch on the top, and let it work its way into the soil. We can turn it into the soil, or we can do things like compost plugs and stuff, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the other thing is compost tea, which I'll talk about next hour. Yes, ma'am.
One of my favorite things to add to my compost, I've compost been going in Faithworks behind our commercial kitchen and 2 composts at the house, but just made a commitment a year ago to try and stop throwing away all the cardboard boxes that I order groceries and whatever from. I use my office shredder and one at home to shred cardboard boxes.
Yep.
And I love adding that for the paper product. I love
Yep.
adding that at my house. Our produce this week came in really thick tomato boxes at Faithworks, and the shredded cardboard looks like waffle fries, which I even love that shredded cardboard. But if you just have, we put it in the irrigation system at the house, and the combination of the irrigation and the cardboard, almost anywhere I dig, I get earthworms in my garden, and I think the cardboard is a big part of that. I think the earthworms love cardboard. I can't wait for the class in just a minute to see that.
Yep.
But that combination, just shredding, tearing the boxes apart and running them through the shredder, has just been a highlight of my compost.
Now, the thing is, what's nice about cardboard, it's got, especially the corrugated cardboard, those little holes in between are little air pockets that will help your compost pile survive without having to turn it. So it's kind of a nice thing. The other thing you can do, if you're building a new compost bin or garden bed, especially if you're building a tall raised bed, okay, we saw how much soil costs. For the most part, most plants only will have roots about 6 inches deep, okay? Now, my raised beds are almost 2 feet deep. So what I will do with that is I will take, a lot of times, my cardboard and paper that I just haven't, I'm not even gonna bother shredding it. Layer the bottom layer of those raised beds with a lot of those paper products. They break down slowly. I mean, it's a cold compost bin, basically, at the bottom of my raised bed. And so that works very well for something like that. And you can get rid of a lot of cardboard and paper products that way.
Do you crunch up the paper to make it more airy, or just lay it flat?
I just lay it flat. Usually it's, half torn up because I've had to pull labels off of it and stuff like that. But for the most part, I'm just tossing it in. I'm not even worried about it too much. Just the fact that I'm tossing it, usually it's tumbling enough that it gets little curls and stuff. And then throw like a layer, and I may throw some wood chips in and then throw some more paper in just to give it a little texture to it. So it isn't like a solid mass of paper. But it's there's a raised bed style called hugelkultur. Excuse me, got to get the correct pronunciation. And that's basically what it is. It's using logs normally, but it will work with just paper products. And it works really well because that becomes a very large sponge for moisture underground. So for our adding compost to our soil, cubic yard of compost is 27 cubic feet, which will take, at about a foot deep over 27 square feet, or about 100 square feet, about 3 inches deep. Okay, and that's usually what we're going to try and do is put a couple 3 inches of compost out and then turn that into the soil. Okay, So if we're dealing with, a 3-inch deep till with about 3 inches of compost on top of that, that gives us about a 50-50 mix of compost and soil, which works real well. And so that's a good place to start, thinking of a cubic yard going about a 10 by 10 area. So
you need to figure on amending about a third of your soil,
I usually do a half, but
half of your soil?
as much as you can. Okay, you're not going to over compost your soil because of our soil conditions right now. So if you're putting, 2/3 compost and 1/3 regular soil, that's probably going to be about the max you're going to want to do, because that's going to be a lot of compost. But anything from a quarter to a third will give you reasonably decent soil. You go up to about a half, a 50-50 mix, and it's going to be a really good soil for you to grow in.
The reason I was asking, I was trying to figure how much compost I could generate for what I need or would like to do.
Yeah.
I know a lot of times a pile looks really big on the ground, and then I start spreading it and it doesn't go very far, So like, say that I had a raised bed, that's about 3 cubic feet. 24 cubic feet. That's
3 by 8.
volume.
Yeah.
Roughly the volume of one of these tables
Yep.
raised a foot.
Yeah.
Okay. So
That's going to take a
so
full
that
cubic
means-
yard of compost.
Yeah. So that would take, well, if it's 3 cubic yards volume of soil, and I have to amend it at the minimum of a third, that means I've got to generate 1 cubic yard
Yeah.
of compost just for an area the size
Oh.
of one.
Yeah, well, 3 feet by
Yeah.
9 feet
Okay,
is
so
27 square feet.
1
So.
cubic yard of compost would require, my pile is going to shrink by half. So
Yeah.
1 cubic yard of compost is going to require a 6 by 6 by 6 foot.
No,
6 by
because you're doubling both directions, so that's 8 times. So
Okay.
you'll need, if you want to do 1 foot deep of compost by over about 27 square feet,
Okay.
your original pile will need to be about 2 yards. So 3 by 3 by 6.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I'm just thinking that my old compost thing probably only generated enough compost for a couple of big flower pots. Maybe
Well,
a little area like.
You were saying a 1 foot tall raised bed.
I'm scared I'm not going to be able to make it up.
You said a 1 foot tall raised bed, roughly 27 square feet.
Okay.
3 feet by 9 feet.
Okay.
So once you start with your 1 cubic yard, if you really hot compost it and shrink it down to half that, okay, that's half a yard. So that 27 square feet will be 6 inches deep in compost. So if you fill soil in the rest of that, it'll be half and half compost, half soil. So you can fill a fairly decent sized area.
I feel like most people who live in the city, I'm not talking about living out on a farm where you
Yeah.
got a huge land and a tractor. And
I know.
bulldozers to move everything. I feel like most people are still going to end up having to supplement bacon.
You can. It depends on how much you're trying to do. Like I said, if you're doing 2 cubic yards, okay, so 2 3 by 3 bins next to each other, okay, full of compost, that will give you a fairly decent amount of compost. That'll cover for a decent, turning regular soil into okay soil, okay, at a third, third of a mix. You're talking about each cubic yard is going to cover about 150 square feet.
Okay.
So, and that's a fairly good size garden bed. Now, like I said, the more you go in, the better the soil's going to be. So, 2 cubic yards built up is going to be a fair amount for you. It really is. So. Green sources can be, like I said, coffee grounds, fur babies. If you mow your yard, okay, then you're going to have to try and figure out something. Find somebody that has green sources that would not have a problem with you hauling them off. Horse people are wonderful, but I'll talk about that because that can be a major issue, unfortunately. So, okay, if you're going to do it, especially if you're going to do it as a top dress, like a mulch, really want to make sure you cover up your soil with an actual mulch layer on top of it to keep it from drying out. Okay, we're going to start talking about worms now. So for the one person that's already won the worm composter and then another one that gets one later, they get to learn how to run their worms. Okay, vermiculture is simply farming worms. So it's kind of a neat thing. Reasonably cheap. Not super cheap to get started, but once you get started in it, it's cheap. Nearly free, basically. Pretty easy. They don't take a whole lot of care. Your average pet takes way more care than what your worms will, which will become your new pets. And the nice thing about it is it can be done indoors. Okay, so you can stay out of the heat and still get some compost out of it. Worms are cold-blooded invertebrates. They breathe through a mucus layer that's on their skins. Because of this, they need a lot of moisture, but not too much. Okay, you dry them out, they suffocate. You get them too much water, they drown. But something reasonable, and they'll be okay. By nature, they usually live in the top 6 to 12 inches of soil, usually in leaf litter and things like that. And so they don't like it to go too deep. They don't like getting up on the surface. They dislike light. And so that's their natural habitat, very light, airy type top layer of soil. Their sole job in life is to take organic matter that's starting to decompose and finish processing it out and giving us worm castings or humus. Okay? They don't have teeth, so they can't bite you. The other problem with that, though, is they can't chew food. So what they actually are doing really is gumming off partially rotted food and eating that and digesting it. Okay? So that's one of the things we have to think about. They are hermaphroditic, which means they aren't a male or a female, they are both. But they do need a separate worm to mate with, okay? But they both carry both sex organs. So, when they are ready to breed, they will get this nice little band on them right here. That is what contains both of their sex organs. And then when they go to mate, they kind of just swap back and forth between each other, and they're good to go to drop off the eggs. Now, when we're talking about worms and compost, okay, especially when we're doing a worm bin, we really need to keep up with the correct worms, all right? For the most part, they're called either red wigglers or red tigers. You usually get them online, because you not find these usually in the ground. These are not earthworms, okay? Now, earthworms in your compost pile you will find all the time, but those are not the normal composting worms that we're looking for our worm bins. They're red to maroon in color, slightly striped, as you can see on these. They've got a little bit of banding on them. And if you notice the size difference, they're 2 to 4 inches long, so they're a lot shorter than your average earthworm, okay? But they can convert a lot of organic material into worm castings pretty quickly. They like moist soil. That 50% moisture level that I always talk about for the compost pile, that's what they like. Okay? They want it nice and moist, so that way they don't dry out, they don't drown. All right? If you're comfortable, reasonably comfortable, they're going to be comfortable. 50 to 85 degrees in temperature, okay? So if it gets too hot, they're going to probably suffocate and die. If it gets too cold, they just kind of go dormant. They do freeze if it gets that cold, and it can kill them. So they will reproduce nicely as long as the conditions are good. Lots of food, reasonable, decent environment, in the way of, dark, moist environment with enough worms. They'll reproduce nicely, and your colony of worms can grow pretty good. If they don't like the environment that you have for them, they will try and go find a new one. So they will try and escape if you aren't careful. So if you look at the worm bins that I had here, or the one over there, they've got a nice screen across it so they can't get out. First thing when you think about if you're going to do worms, where are you going to put the worm bin? Okay, we got to keep those environmental conditions what they like. All right, so we want to make sure it's nice and moist, in the bin itself, but we don't want someplace that's going to get too dried out. So someplace outside a lot of times is going to get too dry for them if you aren't careful. They're going to need a couple of square feet in surface area, and about 1 foot deep is all that you need. Remember, that's their normal surface areas, or normal living area out in the wild is only about 1 foot deep at most. So that's all you need. Any of your worm bins that you do build, you want to put holes in. This will allow any excess moisture that is there to drain out. That moisture can actually be used if you add some water and it drains out, you can use that water to go fertilize plants because it'll suck out some of the nutrients out of that soil. If we're looking at indoor locations, it needs to be convenient. We're going to be feeding these things at least on a weekly basis, although it can be daily. Usually weekly is better if you can. And that environment needs to be dark, needs to stay that, reasonably moisture level. So usually indoors, any conditioned space indoors works. We want vibration free. One of the ones, a lot of times people will put it in like a laundry area, which is fine as long as it's not next to the washer or dryer. Because if it's right next to the washer and dryer, the vibrations from those kind of disturb the worms. And they're going to want to try and go away from that. Under sinks work well. It's kind of a dark, moist environment. But if you've got a garbage disposal that you use, that'll kind of vibrate them and not like it. Thing is, you shouldn't need your garbage disposal with worms because they're going to be eating all of your garbage, from your stuff. Garage and closets are some of the other places people will try and do them indoors. The big problem with garages, they do get cold in the winter. They also get extremely hot in the summer. So if you're going to put them in there, you want to try and make sure that it's in a insulated box of some sort a lot of times, just to make sure that temperatures don't get too extreme for them. Okay? Closets will work well, pantries work well, but some people just don't want to put them there because they're like, oh, that's next to my food. Yeah, well, deal with it. If we're going to build a worm bin, this one's out of plastic. The ones I brought today are going to be out of styrofoam. Same principle though. A couple of holes in the bottom. Some holes up near the top above the layer of the soil or food scraps that we've got in there. This will allow oxygen to get in. These are air-breathing critters, so we want to make sure that they do have enough oxygen available to them so that they can actually breathe. But we do want to cover it with screen. Okay, at least 1/4 inch screen, but I would recommend something like this, which is actually window screen that I've just cut and taped onto the top of the box. So works well to keep not only the worms in, but keeps critters like flies out. And we're putting food that's going to rot, so it's going to have flies coming around, or at least trying. when we get ready to build the bed, once we've got the box printed up or prepped up, we've got the holes in the bottom, we've got some air holes on the top. Go ahead and fill your box with shredded paper. Now, everybody wonders, like, why would you use shredded paper? It's because they enjoy shredded paper, at least at first. Okay, so babies we've got in here today. Nice, good, moist, shredded paper. Notice it actually clumps together pretty well. That's because it is moist. It has a tendency to kind of clump. So, but once it's nice and moist, you can go ahead and add in your worms. A couple of cups worth of worms. Like I said, usually you're going to be buying these online. You can buy them in various quantities, however you want. You'll just kind of take them and just drop them into the top of the worm bin. Worms will sit there for a minute. As long as there's some light around, they'll kind of slowly work their way in and just bury themselves in. That's hopefully the last you'll see of them for the most part, unless you're mixing stuff up. Usually want to give them about a week or so in the box, in just that shredded paper environment, so that they kind of get used to, okay, this is where I'm living now, and then eating them. Okay, kind of gives them an idea of, okay, this is home, we're good. Adding it in. If you're doing a worm bin that's not going to be inside, you can go ahead and add other material in there, things like leaves or anything like that. Any natural organic material that we would normally use in a compost pile, we can actually put in this. But a lot of those are going to be have possibility of having insect eggs in it or anything like that, so we may not want those inside. So that's why we usually stick with shredded paper as a starter material for our worm bins if we're doing them inside. The other thing about doing them outside, if you have a large old chest freezer that has died on you, those make wonderful worm bins. They're large, they're insulated, so they don't have the temperature changes. The one problem that we have here, Texas has a law that says you're not allowed to have a refrigerator freezer that is can be sealed to prevent kids from getting in there and getting trapped. So the best bet on that is to go ahead and peel the seals off of this. It means you've got a little bit of an air gap in there, but those doors cannot close. And if you peel off a lot of the shelving material off of that door, or even on a chest freezer, the door itself is not real heavy. So even a small child can open it up, and so that's not a problem. So that kind of gets around that. But that makes a wonderful worm bin. Just need to punch a hole or two in the bottom of it, and preferably lift it up off the ground so the ants don't get into it, because they will.
Ants will crawl up anything.
Yeah, that's the problem. So that's why you try and keep it as best you can away from the ants. Like I said, when you drop them in, that's usually what it's going to look like when you drop your couple cups of worms in. And then, like I said, they'll just kind of vanish right on into the soil or into the shredded paper.
When you order them online, is the 2 cups what they normally say?
Depends on what you want. They have, the place that I order from is a company out of Pennsylvania. It's one of the big worm farms that they have. You can get them, they actually order a set number, anywhere from 100 to thousands, so it's up to you. 100 to 200 is going to be, 100's probably enough for a standard starter kit. I bought the 250 and split it between the 2 boxes. So, yes, ma'am, in the back. It was $37 plus $8 in shipping for 250 worms. So, not real cheap. That's the main cost, really. Yes, ma'am.
There is a place in Austin, Texas called Brothers Worm Farm
Okay.
that I bought mine from last year. They do the red wigglers and a European night crawler.
Okay.
And if you go to their website, you generally order, you can order like 100 or 250 something, but then it starts getting into the pounds, like a quarter pound, a half pound, a full pound, and then they do have some really, really cool worm bins. that are really expensive.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, it's like everything out there, but it's a Texas company, like
Yeah.
that's.
Yeah, and like I said, the one that I ordered from is the one that I know specifically was good. I didn't know about the one in Texas. Yeah, the worm rids that you can buy online, some can be fancy and rather expensive. I found those things have gone up seriously in price in the last 10 years. Those used to be $1.50. They are now $6 a piece. And right now it's kind of hard to find those. I had to go to 6 different stores to get 4 of these. Just, and the last one I ran into was like, oh no, I've got a stack of them over here. I'm like, gee, why didn't you tell me that? So, but it's kind of interesting to find those nowadays. They're a little bit harder to find. Let's see. Okay, so when we're talking feeding, oh, the question?
You're probably going to get to this, but when you add water, do you do filtered water or do you do tap water?
I use just straight tap water for these.
Do you spray it?
Because this was, I was doing fairly good sized bin all at once. I filled it. I put probably a gallon of water in each, and then kept adding shredded paper till I had the mass that I wanted, and then dumped off the extra water before I put it in. I just wanted to make sure everything got well soaked before I actually, added the worms in, because I didn't want them having any stress when I put them in. So, if you can get rainwater, that would be better. But, tap water is not going to hurt them for this sort of a thing, at least. Now, to keep them moist long term, a little spritz bottle will work well. But we can also do other things too. When we're talking food scraps works great for them. Adding things like, cucumber peels. We have cucumber salad out here. Guess where these came from? But when we're looking at these, we're going to try and feed them, and we usually try and feed them on alternating ends. Okay, we'll feed on one side, and we'll let the worms really what happens is the worms will let that start rotting itself and decomposing a little on its own until it softens up a bit, and then they'll come over and they'll start eating the softer material.